Well, welcome. I thank you again for coming out. I wanted to share a quick article I read last night. It's in relation to the supernova and some of the things we were talking about. I just want to read it real quick. I'm only going to read part of it, but you'll get the idea. Supernova remnants are shells of material expanding outward from stellar explosions. Presumably, one can tell how long ago a star exploded by measuring the velocity of the expanding shell and extrapolating it backward in time. In the case of RCW86 in Centaurus, the calculated time of explosion was 10,000 years. According to Space.com, in 2006, astronomers now realize it was witnessed by the Chinese astronomers just 1,821 years ago. This means the earlier date was off by over 80%. From the Chandra X-ray data, they now believe the expanding shell rammed into interstellar material, slowing it down and making it pile up. Extrapolating the current speed backward linearly was based on a flawed assumption. And another one here, one of the most widely dispersed SNRs, that's supernova remnant, in the northern skies has a similar tale to tell. The Veil Nebula arches into graceful loops over a large region in Cygnus. Earlier estimates of its age were in the tens of thousands of years. In 2001, however, Sky and Telescope reported a surprise. By comparing Hubble views with photographs taken in 1953, the new recalculated age is just 5,000 years. Two others that were reported as ancient, that's all it says is ancient, so probably millions or whatever years old, in the Large Magellanic Cloud were reported in Nature in 2005 to just be 410 and 610 years old. So, as I was saying, there's a lot of assumptions in everything science sees. Had they taken the Bible at face value and everything was 6,000 years old, they would have said, hey, that doesn't seem right. Maybe we should look a little harder. Might have actually gotten the answer earlier. But tonight we are going to talk about days 5 and 6. I'm going to apologize right now. I am probably going to go over on this one because this is the one that gets me the most. It's DNA, it's life. If there's anything that proves that God created everything, it's us. And it's living things. So we got a lot of reading here, day 5 and 6, Genesis 1 and 20. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that it may fly above in the earth, in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas. And let the fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. And by the way, that verse, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air. If you remember when we were talking on day 1 of verse 2, how it was an explanatory gloss. I said that was a Hebrew phrase because it was connected with a noun. That verse right there, and to every beast of the earth, is the only other one in this whole chapter that is the same format. So we have that God created all life. And interestingly, parts of it kind of match up with what evolution teaches. Evolution teaches life came from the water. Well, technically, they're right. The very first life was created from the water that we read here. It's just how it was created is not right, and when. The Bible is clear that the first life came from waters. They think this happened spontaneously. This could not have happened without God being involved. There are a lot of things about DNA that whenever you get down into the molecular level and start looking at it, if you create a strand of DNA and you don't have it protected with all of the other things around it, water destroys it. It cannot be formed in water. Water is devastating to life at that level. So water is necessary for life, but DNA has to be protected from it because it breaks it down. It's like putting water on steel. It rusts. Water does the same thing to DNA. It causes it to break down and decay very, very quickly. So DNA could not have been formed in water without protective barriers and everything that God put in place around it to begin with. Another thing that we read in the Bible, and this is one thing that really angers me, honestly. Birds were first. Birds came before land animals. The entire push today, and it doesn't surprise me, and I'm guessing it's because birds are actually mentioned in the Bible, is that dinosaurs turned into birds. And I'm honestly, seriously considering the fact that Satan's picking this one out on purpose. Because anyone who has never read the Bible is going to look at what's being taught out there and go, oh yeah, dinosaurs turned into birds. And then they're going to look at the Bible and go, birds first? That can't be right. We went to the Natural History Museum not too long ago. And I fully was aware that they were going to have evolutionary teaching and things like that. But they had this special dinosaur exhibit that you had to pay a little extra for. Didn't say what it was. They just said, oh, we have this extra dinosaur exhibit. I was like, oh, cool. Maybe we'll see some fossils and stuff. I knew it wasn't going to be all that, biblical. But, we were there and I paid the extra money. It was all about birds. There wasn't a single dinosaur in there. It was everything about birds. That's all we saw was a bunch of birds. I wanted my money back, but apparently they didn't do that. So they keep teaching that dinosaurs turned into birds. The problem is when you look at the geologic layers, birds are already found with dinosaurs. They find the bones everywhere. They find 450 species of mammals that they didn't say came till millions of years later. They find them with dinosaurs. Beavers, rodents, all sorts of stuff, they're found with dinosaurs. So the whole bird thing just chaps me the wrong way. We talk about the firmament. The birds flew on the face of the firmament. The New King James says the birds flew on the face of the firmament. So this is just another spot where I'm reiterating that the firmament in Genesis, I believe, is the entire universe. So the word panim means on the face of, and it is primarily translated as either face or before. Brown Driver Briggs when it has a preposition. So in this case, it actually does have a preposition in front of it. It means in front of, before, to the front of. So when we're looking up at the sky, the birds are flying across it. That means the firmament was behind them. The meaning has no connotation of the birds flying in it. They're flying in front of it, on the face of it. So the firmament is definitely behind them according to the language that is used. Now, the word for great whales is tanin or tanim. It can, I guess, end in both. Basically, this word means monster. So when it says God created great whales, this word is almost always translated as dragon everywhere else in the Bible. There's a lot of places in the Bible that talk about dragons. So even the BDB definition is dragon, serpent, sea monster, dragon or dinosaur, sea or river monster, serpent, venomous snake. It can be used in a couple different places, but at least Brown Driver Briggs acknowledges it can mean dinosaur. And that's exactly what God created at this time. He created dinosaurs. And we have seen, especially in the oceans, they get to be huge. Leviathan is talked about in Job. Leviathan was a creature that no man could go up against. They had no way of killing this creature. Well, harpoons are used on whales. They're used on sharks. They're used on a ton of different creatures. So using a simple harpoon, a simple spear, you're able to pierce the hide of most large creatures today. Whatever they're talking about was more like a gigantic crocodile or something. I forget the name of this creature here. I don't think it's a megalodon, but whatever it was, there was a giant crocodile that was essentially the size of a small whale that used to swim around in the oceans. And that, I don't know if that was Leviathan or not, but it definitely would have fit the bill. But this word is translated as dragon, as I said, in many other places. And the word dinosaur didn't come out until about the 1800s, I believe. So it couldn't appear in the Bible because when the King James did their initial translation, the word didn't exist. They could have changed it later. Most people just leave it as dragon because that's what it is. That's what they had. It's also interesting that the Chinese zodiac, the Chinese calendar, has 11 real animals and a dragon. Why would they have 11 real ones and one fake one? So, yes, today they draw it as the mythical dragon that we think of, but it probably came from history, and dragons that's what they called a giant lizard. There are stories of Napoleon, and his name slipping my mind, Alexander the Great. There's stories that they wrote down of battling large monsters living in caves. Creatures that we can't define today from what we know. So dinosaurs definitely were created by God. I believe all kinds of dinosaurs were actually on the ark. And if we were talking about the flood, I'd be getting into a lot more detail there. But suffice it to say, right now, creationists believe that there was maybe only 50 or 60 actual kinds of dinosaurs. With all the dinosaurs that we find, there may have only been 50 or 60 kinds. Because there was just a lot of versions, just like we have a lot of different kinds of dogs. We have huge dogs, little dogs, tiny dogs, useless dogs. There's a lot of different kinds of animals. Well, there's a lot of degree and range of degree for dinosaurs as well. And again, we read about the kind. So God's kind, we don't know what that is. So let me make that clear right now. The kind that is referred to in the Bible, we do not know what that is. All we know is that it can be categorized by can they reproduce. Today, we have lost some of that. So today, animals can become so speciated, if that's a word. They can become so unique as a species that they may not be able to actually breed anymore with another species of their own kind. But that's genetic loss. That's because they've lost genetic material. They've lost the ability to do it. It's not that they've gained anything new. They're actually losing material. We're actually becoming the bottom of the gene pool, unfortunately. So if you go back, there's a lot more creatures that could have been generally able to reproduce. There was probably only a cat kind. There was probably only a dog kind. Now, God says he made many different bird kinds, and that's what we find. Ostriches are a lot different than penguins, and so on and so forth. So there are many different kinds of animals, but in all reality, the high-end estimate for the many kinds God created is about 35,000. Which, when you think about that, if that was the maximum number of creatures that had to fit on the ark, that's not that many. That includes dinosaurs. 35,000 kinds. The typical accepted answer is around 16,000. So it's only about half that. And it could be as low as 7,000, depending on where it falls in. Right now, current estimate is somewhere between family and order in our current classification of animals. It says God created land animals, cattle, creeping things, beasts of the earth. Cattle suggests that many animals were created, domesticated from the start. So oxen, cows, horses, the animals that are used for labor. God had created them that way from the beginning. Now, it's true some became domesticated afterwards, but from the beginning, God had intended for animals to help out man. Now, I'm just throwing this in there just to let you be aware. I don't have a problem with it, but there is some debate out there about whether all land animals, mostly insects, fall into these kind of categories. So insects are an interesting creation into and of itself, and there is debate out there as to what they fall under. But I'm just leaving it at that. I'm just letting you know that if you hear that somebody can't classify it, well, yeah, there's questions about where they go, but obviously God created them under one of them. They just don't know which one it is. From the beginning, God probably created an extremely wide range of species. So evolution would teach that there was a single animal, and that single animal had to scratch and crawl and grab at every single thing it could get. Apparently it found food. Apparently it could reproduce on its own. Apparently it could keep reproducing and not get killed by any of the radiation and everything else that was bombarding the earth at that time. It was able to continue to survive. and it eventually became a plant. So the rocks became plants, and then eventually the plants became creatures, and the creatures became us. That's essentially what they teach. So your greatest grandfather was a rock. That's what they teach. Now what's interesting is, based on the fossil records that we were able to see, only about 30% of the known species are still alive today. So when they look in the fossil record, they see more species of animals, more sharks, more squid, more clams, more trilobites, more all sorts of stuff. They see more of it than we have today. That's the opposite of what you would expect if it was evolution. Evolution should look like a tree that very slowly branches out, and we should be the pinnacle. Because if you start with one, and then one splits off and goes to plants, so you cut it right in half there, and the tree has to kind of start over again, because you have the very first animal then at a different spot. It should be branching out like this. What we see is the exact opposite. We see tons of creation, tons of life, tons of species, and it's narrowing as we are going through a fallen creation. We are taught that every creature was vegetarian. Every creature ate plants. That's what plants were made for. God created the food on day 3. He had to make sure he had enough food for everything he was about to create. So the plants, as I said, plants are not alive. They can't be killed in the biblical sense. They were food. They are a complex replicating food source. Still today, we can find vegetarian animals that you wouldn't think were vegetarian. They have found an entire species of spiders. Only eats plants. Spiders. We always think spiders eat just insects. But there's at least one species still out there that eats nothing but plants. Lions have been known to eat fruit if they need to. If food is scarce and there's fruit available, they will still eat fruit. They can still eat it, process it, no problems. There's a species of piranha. Only eats plants. Doesn't eat any meat. None whatsoever. Crocodiles have also been known to find and eat fruit if they need to. If food is scarce and there's fruit available, they will eat the fruit. It doesn't bother them. So, obviously that's not proof, but it's definitely evidence that people, who say carnivores can't eat fruit. Well, there's actually a tiger in captivity right now that only eats fruit. I read about that. Now that's only one. It's only one example, but it's there. It can happen. And the fact that there's any left in a fallen world that's now basically 4,000 years from the flood being recreated and with all the mutations and everything, it's amazing we find anything that's left. What we're actually seeing is God's preservation of his species and kinds through grace to even allow us to make it this far. Now, man. Whenever we talked about the whales, the great whales being created, that word created there again was bara. And I told you that word is only used of God, and it seems to mean created from nothing. So the creatures in the water were created from nothing. Well, I think God used materials that were there, but I think he gave them something that wasn't there before, because he gave them something plants didn't have. Bara is not used with plants. And I think the Bible says in a few spots that animals have spirits. I don't know that it says they have souls, and I could be wrong on that, but they definitely have something else about them. Our pets have personalities. We can see creatures with personalities, and there's something about them that just is unique. It's unique to them. And then there's something that's very unique to us. Man is also created. Now, it says that he was formed in another spot, but I believe that whenever God said he made us in his image, this is body, soul, and spirit. The soul and spirit part are the pieces that we can't define by matter. We can't. They're not made of atoms. They're not made of anything that we can describe. They're made of something that God breathed into man. And this is where that information came from the very first day, which we'll be talking about a little more. Yeah, Genesis 2, it says the man was formed, Yatsar. That has the idea of hands-on, and I love this picture. I know other people have used this picture. But a hands-on creation of man. So he was intimately involved in the creation of man. This was something he took his time with. This was something that he wanted to be perfect. It was the pinnacle of his creation. So we are the more than the sum of our parts. And as I said, soul and spirit are not matter. They will never die. All matter will eventually die. It's an atomic process that doesn't last forever. Eventually, this universe will run out of energy and every particle will cease to exist. That's where we're headed. But our souls and our spirits will live on forever, according to the Bible. So they cannot be part of matter. They are the information part. They are the part that allow us to think of abstract ideas. They allow us to look at things and go, oh, I can derive something else from that image. I can look at a picture and it speaks to me in 1,000 words. That's not part of matter. That's part of something else. Now, science will try and tell you that's part of the brain. Yes, there are parts of our brain that work whenever we do those things. Our body is tied to our soul and spirit. Our body affects us. If we have a mental handicap, that affects what we're able to do. But that's a fallen problem. That's not something God designed. So we're going to talk about mutations and things in just a minute here. But there are many things that we need to understand. Our body is a vehicle that we are tied to for now. So lusts of the flesh, things that our minds do whenever somebody cuts us off on the road and our mind goes, and says a whole bunch of things that I'm not going to say on a podium. Those kind of things we're stuck with for now because our body does that. We're just stuck with those things. God's going to give us a new body one day. He promised everyone who trusts him that he's going to give them a new body without those problems. So we will still be us, but we're not going to have any of those issues. I don't know what that's going to be like. I'm looking forward to it. But each one of us is unique. And I think God loves that about us. When he said we're going to get a new body, we're not going to be a new us. It's not that we're going to, basically our memories are gone and we're going to just be switched on as a completely different person. I don't think that's what it is. That's what it is at all. He made us unique. When it talks about God forming us, I think that's what it's talking about, that spirit, that soul. That's what God loves. God doesn't look on the outward appearance. He doesn't look on our outward bodies. I also will argue God does not create mutated babies. Okay? God does not do that. Sin has done that. Sin has caused mutation. To say that God caused a baby to be born with deformities is not right. That was never God's intention. God does not purposefully blind or maim or do any kind of stuff. That is a result of sin. That is a result of the fall. That is a result of the mutations that we can see and observe. But that person one day will have all those problems removed, and that unique individual will be able to stand before God. And it'll probably be a great thing that the people who know them really won't recognize them because they're going to see the true person that was meant to be. Now, DNA. All right, so you're going to have to follow me quick on this one. I got a ton of slides, and I'm going to have to move through them pretty quick here. So, DNA is made up of 4 bases. That's what I'm going to call the code. It's adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. Makes up 3-letter words that we will call codons. So there's 4 letters, and they're all read. DNA is all read in chunks of 3. So when we look at the picture, each one of those little connectors, those lines, that's a base. When it's read, you take 3 of them at a time. That's the way DNA works. There is meaning. Each 3-letter word represents one of 22 amino acids. It used to be 20. It's actually 22 now. 20 are common in all life. There are 2 that are extremely rare and only found in certain forms of life, and I haven't dug into it yet, but I want to make sure I'm giving you the right number. There's actually 22 now that are out there. I was taught 20 in school. 2 more have been recently found in the last few years. There is an expected action that DNA is trying to do. It's trying to create proteins, which are biomachines used for the functions of an organism. So that is an abstract idea. The code in DNA is read and then compiled into proteins and into machines that are then used to keep life and cells and everything going. So its intended purpose, the purpose of DNA, the purpose of that information is life. I want to talk real briefly about DNA capability. And I'm sorry for everyone that had my ministry message a few months ago. This is a repeat of that information. But there is an information scientist by the name of Dr. Werner Gitt. And he he's the one that came up with the universal definition of information, but he's also a creationist, thankfully. And he's an expert on DNA. So he did a bunch of calculations that I thought was really neat, and I'm showing you a picture of a pinhead. So you see the top of the pin. It's the little round ball. That's what I'm talking about as far as space goes here. Now, DNA winding, so a full winding of DNA, can hold 10 letters. The volume of a winding, and it gives the numbers here. I'm not going to read all these numbers out. But essentially, when you look at the volume of a pinhead and the volume of the windings, and you figure out how much DNA you could compact and fit into a pinhead, you would end up with 3 quintillion, 940 quadrillion letters. Those aren't numbers we use very often. But according to his calculations, 3 quintillion, 940 quadrillion letters would fit inside of a pinhead. Now those numbers are huge. Really doesn't mean much to us, so we need some perspective. If you have a 160-page book with typical paper, it's 12 millimeters thick, and with an estimated 250,000 letters per book. So when you take this distance and you start to figure out how many letters you could fit on books and you start to stack the books up, the distance to the moon is 384,000 kilometers. If you were stacking books to the moon and back, you'd be able to do it 492 and a half times. Stacking books from here to the moon and back 492 and a half times for the information that would fit in a pinhead of space. Now, most people don't realize how far away the moon actually is. And my boss actually showed me this a week ago. So obviously I've been grilling him with creation stuff for quite a while now. He's probably sick of it. But he showed me an article. He said, did you know, and this was a true article, I read it myself. Did you know that you can fit between us and the moon every single planet in the solar system, including Pluto? Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Side by side will all fit in that space with room to spare between us and the moon. So even 384,000 kilometers is something that we're not probably comprehending correctly. You think Jupiter's huge, right? It fits between us and the moon. So that's a big distance. All right, this one I actually put a reference to because I copied and pasted this right out of the article. It says a new study from Karolinska Institute, I'm not sure if I said that right, shows that the grammar of the human genetic code is more complex than of even the most intricately constructed spoken languages in the world, end quote. This coming from scientists who are looking at DNA and trying to decode the language. They admit it's more complex than any language in the world. That includes Chinese, Japanese, Aramaic, Hebrew, all of those languages. I mean, the Chinese have, 40,000 letters, something like that for the old kind of Chinese. So some 40,000 letters. DNA is more complex, far superior. The only thing that represents it is computer programming languages. I'm a computer programmer, my area of expertise. That's the closest thing we have to compare how DNA works. And even inside DNA, there are multiple languages. It's not just one language fits all. In certain circumstances, DNA will do something different with the same code than it would do in a different place. Just like I said, when I'm writing a computer program, I can take ones and zeros and they can appear as letters on the screen. I can take those same ones and zeros, put them in an image map, and they'll show up as graphics on the screen. It's the context that matters. DNA is the same way. The only difference is DNA is actually read both forwards and backwards. It's read overlapped as if you were trying to decode something. And then once it's stacked, it's read in three dimensions. It's read vertically. So different information is pulled out going this way. You've heard of a palindrome, right? Madam, I'm Adam. It goes forward and backwards. Well, the difference is that's the same both ways. DNA gives a different piece of information going backwards than it does going forward. And it's all perfect. That's why mutations are so difficult to say it can improve anything. Because a mutation may make a good change going this way, but it breaks something going this way. And then it breaks something going the other way. And it breaks something when it overlaps. There's too many things. To find the perfect... I honestly spent about 2 hours trying to come up with a sentence that reads one way going left to right and a different way going right to left. I came up with nothing. I tried to do it myself. I didn't Google it. Maybe there's one out there. I tried to come up with it myself. I was like, okay, can I even do this on my... I couldn't do it. I couldn't come up with even a simple sentence that would make any sense. So, another thing DNA does, it actually becomes a tool as part of the construction. So not only is it the information, it's the blueprint of what's being built, it then becomes a hammer or a cement mixer or whatever you want to call it. The DNA is actually built into a 3D structure that then is used for the proteins to actually be formed around and put together after it's read. So it tells the machines how to build the structure, and then it makes its own self a structure to be put into the process of building proteins. They found out that there is code within code. So at the top are the letters of I gave you the 4 types of bases. These letters are just representing the front letter of those. So GGC, GGA, GGU, GGG doesn't make that much of a difference, but they're all codes for the amino acid glycine. So evolution thought, oh, well, it's a degenerative process that happened over years of evolution. That's what they thought. So they ignored it. They didn't look at it. They left it go for like decades. And then somebody, obviously probably a creationist, I'm not sure, but somebody went, it doesn't make sense that God would just have all this waste. Because they talked about junk DNA. They had all this extra DNA that they were looking at. It didn't look like it did anything. They're like, it doesn't do anything. It's probably junk from millions and billions of years of evolution. Well, what they're finding out is that it's called the wobble position. It helps a little bit with mutation problems. So it might be something God put in place, because if you change it, you do get a slightly different protein, but it's not that bad. You might still be okay. You basically get maybe a different allele of a gene or something like that, but you're probably going to be okay in most cases. But what they ended up finding out was each one of those letters, they were able to actually watch the machines take the DNA and read it. So these machines grab the DNA and they go, okay, we're going to fold a protein. And you can kind of get an idea at the bottom of how protein's folded. Well, when they hit those letters, they stop for different amounts of time depending on what the letter is. God put timing language into the code so that as the DNA is folding, it knows, I got to wait a second because it's got to go a little bit farther. Oh, okay, now I can start again. The machinery actually reads it and waits different amounts depending on that wobble position of the DNA. So not only is the DNA telling it, hey, this person's going to have green hair or red hair or whatever, when it's building the protein, it says, hey, you got to wait an extra second for that. That's like an encrypted code inside of another code. How on earth did the very first organism come up with the structures necessary to read that code? Just to build any protein, you need to be able to read that correctly. If those codes get mutated, as I said, in some situations, it's a minor change. But glycine is only one kind of amino acid. There are other amino acids, they don't allow a wobble position. So you change one code, and it ends up being what I would call a stop bit. In computer programming languages, whenever you read a string, like a C string, you look for a null at the end. So you read ASCII characters, and you look for a null, which is the value 0, 0. So when I'm reading a string, if I have to read something manually, I process all the information until I find 0, 0. I know I have to stop there. Well, sometimes the mutations cause these little things to stop. So a protein's halfway through and chops it right in half. And that's when we start to get disease and we start to get bad things to happen. So it's extremely complicated, trust me. I tried to even come up with some way to explain it. I'm just going to have to tell you to go read the research yourself, because I spent days, weeks, and I was like, okay, I'm not getting anywhere. I'm just going to have to say it's really complicated. Because depending on where you're at, whether you're in the liver, whether you're in the heart, whether you're in the bones, it all works differently. God has designed the DNA, the same kind of information, to work differently in different places. And actually, the same code can mean something different depending on where it's at. Built into DNA and the process is error correction. As many of you have probably seen, the error correction on my slides was not working. I was told by Josh about the black hoses that I was talking about yesterday instead of the black holes. Thanks for everybody else who let me know about that. Although hoses obviously was spelled correctly, so I wouldn't have seen it. But I'd been going through slides. I made 150 slides or so, and I realized that the error correction didn't work until I closed it and opened it back up. As I was looking, it wasn't underlining anything, even though I had everything turned on. I don't know what the problem is. I'm a computer programmer. I couldn't fix it. I just shut it off, turned it back on, and was like, okay, now I can find out what's all wrong. But built into DNA is error correction. So in computers, we have what is referred to as a parity bit. And it's sent along with other bits, and it says whether there's an even or an odd number of ones in the piece of information that I'm sending. So I'll send a chunk of data, and if there's an even number, and this could be wrong because I don't remember exactly, but if there's an even number, it's a 1. If it's an odd number, it's a 0, or vice versa, whichever, doesn't matter. But what that basically does is, so if data is being transferred and one of those bits somehow flips, then it'll read the parity bit and say, hey, it's supposed to be even, but I got odds. There's a corruption. And that's usually when you get file error when you try to open a file. And you have to download it again. Something happened. Nobody knows what. The problem with it is there's only one bit. So if 2 bits flip, we're still good. Because the parity bit says, oh yeah, that's still the right, I'm still even, and it lets it go. So if you have 2 bits in the same chunk flip, which is odd, but if it ever happens, it wouldn't know the difference and you'd have a corrupted file. Now, for a computer programmer, when that happens, it's a failure. It typically means fail. Do it again. DNA has a built-in system and systems similar to this, but it's able to correct with backup copies that it has all over the place. The incorrect base could be repaired by referring to its paired base on the opposite strand, since DNA is double-stranded, or the alternate copy on its sister chromatid, or yet another copy found on the second chromosome. So it's got multiple backup copies it can go to if it finds an error. And it's able to repair the problem based on that. Again, it depends on where you're at. So certain areas are much less, there's less error correction for whatever reason. In some areas, like mitochondria, that's the information that we use primarily to process energy. That's what takes our food and turns it into energy. Without it, we're dead. The error correction there is pretty darn good. Hair color, not so much. If your hair changes to white, or whatever the case is, that it happens, it's not a big deal. The error correction is not as robust as it is in other places. There's DNA mechanisms that will take and basically what happens is it also works like you ever use a multimeter to test a circuit? You know, I've done it. I'm not very good at it, but I get the gist of it. You see if there's resistance, right? You want to see if something's blown and there's no electricity flowing through a circuit. So you take your 2 leads and you put an electric current through it. If you've got 100% resistance, you know, something broke. Well, there are mechanisms that will actually go to DNA or go to the proteins and the structures, and it will send an electric current through it. Actually sends an electron through it and waits for it to come back. If it doesn't come back, it knows there's a problem. And somehow it knows where the problem is. It calls its buddies who come over and make a patch for the issue. If I had that in the computer world, I wouldn't get so many calls in the middle of the night saying, hey, something broke. So DNA is extremely, extremely complex. In order to make a protein, it takes about 75 molecules in addition to the DNA. So making proteins requires proteins. Ribosomes are built so that they can hold 3 and only 3 bases, hence the codon. They are made of over 50 proteins. They are what read the DNA. Without them, DNA is useless. They interpret it. but you need 50 proteins already built just to make one. So DNA, RNA, and proteins are needed to build proteins. Ribosomes are made of over 50 proteins and are needed to put together codons. How could the first ribosome have ever been made by chance? In my opinion, it's impossible. It can't be done. This setup is analogous to a car engine. We have a battery in the car to start the engine, but once the engine's started, it recharges the battery. So you need something in place to get going, but then once it's going, you've got a nice steady flow of energy going. Nobody's going to look at a car engine. That's a Corvette engine. It actually looks pretty nice. Nobody's going to look at a car engine and go, somebody dropped all these parts and they put themselves together. I've recently started working on my car and trying to do a lot of my own work. Trust me, it didn't accidentally get put together because it's impossible to get apart in some cases. But every piece of the motor has a purpose and it makes sense how and why it works inside the engine, but nobody would believe that it was just dropped and put together. Francis Crick, who co-shared a Nobel Prize for the discovery of DNA structure, currently gives seminars on why life could never happen by evolution. Unfortunately, he's the ID Intelligent Design group, so he doesn't believe in God, but he believes in aliens and other things that could have created life. He knows that life had to have been created by something intelligent, but he will not acknowledge God as the one who did it. But still, the person who is intimately involved with this knows it can't happen by chance. Now, mutations. The Bible tells us we live in a fallen world. Adam and Eve fell. We read that all of creation was cursed because of Adam. It wasn't just man, everything. That, I believe, includes the stars, the galaxies, the entire creation. Because all of it was for man. When man sinned, all of it fell. Now, mutations occur in cells all the time. So right now, mutations are occurring in our body. They just are. Healthy cells, as I said with the error correction, are able to fix these things. But all mutations, every single one, is a modification of existing material. You can't make a new sentence without words and without letters. That's all it's doing. It's rearranging letters and words in an already formed sentence, and in most cases, screwing it up. But take away letters, words, ink, and everything else, and it's got nothing to work with. Radiation does not build DNA. It does not build information. It can't. The very definition of a mutation says there has to be an existing piece of material to work on. And as we talked about, the TCSD, time, chance, struggle, and death, are the mechanisms evolution uses to build new structures. So mutations are real. The question is, are there limits to what a mutation can do? So to give kind of a silly example, you could calculate how long it would take you to ride your bike to the moon. You could do that. You could figure out how fast you can ride a bike. I told you the moon's 384,000 kilometers away. You can extrapolate from that how long it would take you to ride your bike to the moon. However, in real life practice, it's never going to happen. There are limits. You can't overcome gravity on a bicycle. Won't happen. Now, natural selection. And I want everybody to get the main idea of this, because natural selection is something that actually happens, okay? Nobody's denying that natural selection occurs. It's definitely a real event. And that's why we have species. Because given a certain environment, the traits that help the animal survive there are the ones that then stay dominant, because the other ones die off. So, for example, if you're in an environment where you need a long neck to be able to get food and you're the only one that can eat, and only other ones with long necks were able to eat, well, guess what? All the short-necked ones die out, and the people with long necks survive. And in that area, you will have a bunch of creatures with long necks. But the long necks were already there to begin with. The point is, the long necks it wasn't the creatures were going like this for 1 million years trying to reach food, and their necks got bigger. It doesn't work. The idea is stupid. Everybody would have died out if they didn't have somebody there to survive. So this is not some mythical force capable of producing complex creatures. In fact, the definition of fittest in survival of the fittest, which is also natural selection, may surprise you. It is not the strongest, the fastest, or the smartest. It is simply the one that successfully reproduces. So if all the strongest went out to fight a war and died, and it was the lazy one sitting behind that survived and reproduced, guess what? He's the fittest. That's natural selection for you. It has nothing to do with what we would think. We think, oh, it's the strongest lion, it's the toughest bear. Nothing to do with it whatsoever. The whole idea is circular reasoning, and as I said, it does happen. But it's not a process that builds bigger and better animals. So this whole idea is based, the fittest are those that survive in greatest numbers, but those that survive in greatest numbers are considered the fittest. There's nothing about it that determines, by looking now, who's going to survive. You have to wait until the next generation. That's what scientists do. You can't look at a generation and go, oh, that's the trait that makes that guy the fittest. You don't know until the next generation, and you see what traits happen. It's a reactive theory. It's a reactive process. We don't know who the survivors are until they survive. Irreducible complexity. This is a phrase that was coined by a man named Michael Behe, I believe is how you say it. He is not a creationist. He is a biochemist. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. It is an excellent read. In fact, I highly recommend it, with the stipulation he's not a creationist, so don't expect him to be talking about God the Creator. But there are compound traits. Now, the way evolution is supposed to work is that if somehow these things were able to evolve, in order for a trait to exist, it can only exist if and only if each separate step has a survival value on its own. That's the only way it works, by the definition of evolution. So if you have multiple pieces, each piece has to have a function that has some survival value to the animal by itself. This bombardier beetle, I know everybody's seen it. It's probably an overused example, but it's a really good one. So this beetle is able to, and as you see at the top, it's spraying somebody's finger. I'm actually curious as to whether that person got burns or not. But what happens is this beetle has, the simple diagram below, it has hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone. I'm not sure if I said that right. But essentially, it's able to mix these two things together, blow it out its rear end at 212 degrees, the boiling point of water. I watched a video online and I actually saw an ant melt. This beetle hit an ant and it basically disintegrated right there in front of it. So if those chemicals were to ever combine inside the animal without all of the mechanisms in place to keep them separated and safe, there's survival of the fittest. That one's gone. Didn't make it because those chemicals inside the body are poisonous and toxic. When we look at an animal cell, they are complex. And I don't know what all of these things are. To be perfectly honest, we're going to talk about a few of these, but you can see some ribosomes, you can see the nucleus, some mitochondria we are going to talk about. And then there's pieces that are unique to animals that plants don't have. So plant and animal cells are not exactly the same. As you can see by the right there, not in most plant cells. But there are similar structures across the board. Now, I can't fault the theory of evolution for this, because I like science. Science is based on theories. A lot of what I gave you the first 3 days are theories. They might be right, they might be wrong, I have no idea. They're theories. That's what science is based on. So what they do is they look at animal cells and they look at plant cells and they see a lot of similarities. Oh, they got a lot of the same parts. Well, they must have all come from the same place. That's actually a logical conclusion. If they all have the same parts, then they all came from the same place. Or maybe the same person made them. And the parts that worked, he liked, and he reused them over and over and over and over and over again. I have a book at home that I use to fix my car. It's for a Trailblazer. It also works for a GMC Envoy. They're two different cars, two different manufacturing plants, but guess what? They've got basically the same engine. because the same company owns both parties. So all the bolts are the same sizes, everything I need to know is the same between both. So they stopped making Trailblazers. If I want to keep working on my vehicle the way I like it, I'm going to buy an Envoy because it's basically the same thing. But that doesn't mean that somebody was in a factory, dropped a wrench in the production thing, and all of a sudden an Envoy came out when they were making Trailblazers. They went, oh, look at that. We got a new vehicle. We're going to relabel it. It's not what happened. The same people designed it. Mutations actually occur relatively infrequently. And I say relatively. There's only a 1 in a 10 million chance of a mutation occurring in a DNA molecule. 1 in 10 million. Anybody here send emails and texts to people? Have you ever gotten one that wasn't misspelled? I haven't. I haven't sent one that wasn't misspelled. So I can't write 50 letters without making a mistake. The design process only allows 1 in 10 million mistakes. Now the problem is, cells are very, 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 very small. We have over 100 trillion cells. So 1 in 10 million compared to 100 trillion means there's a lot of mutations going on. We're going to take a quick look at some mutational math. And I know everybody loves math, but these numbers are great. So the problem with evolution isn't mutations, it's related mutations. So we got tons of mutations, but it's one cell here, one cell there. It's not enough to make any kind of significant change. In order for evolution to work, you would need a related change. You would need something that actually built upon itself multiple times. Well, if we take 1 times 10 to the 7th, the way probability works is you take the total probability and you times it by itself to get a second related one. So that means you need 1 times 10 to the 14th, so 1 in that chance, and that's actually 1 trillion, or 100 trillion. So in our bodies, there is only 1 cell in our entire body that has a chance of having a duplicate mutation. Now, mutations happen constantly. Don't get me wrong. So at any one time, there's only 1 cell that has a chance to get a duplicate mutation. But the odds of 3 mutations jumps to 10 to 21. The ocean would not be big enough if it was filled with bacteria to find 1 bacteria with 3 related mutations, if the entire oceans were nothing but bacteria, with 10 to the 21 as a number. Once you do 4 related mutations, the entire Earth, the entire volume of the Earth is not big enough to contain the bacteria that would be needed. This was enough to cause microbiologists to give up on mutations as being the cause for bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. They actually thought at the beginning mutations were what was causing it. Once they realized the probability of just 4, they gave up and they started looking elsewhere. Smart men. They ended up finding it. Variations in bacteria DNA was built into it from the beginning. They have found antibiotic-resistant bacteria in ancient life forms. I say ancient meaning pre-antibiotics, so just a couple hundred years. But they found the resistance. It was there already. So it was already there. And then they also found out that bacteria has these things called plasmids, which allow them to actually transmit DNA from one to another. So bacteria that are surviving will actually communicate. They're finding out bacteria is actually pretty social. And bacteria will communicate with other bacteria. So basically, they're like, hey, we're surviving in here. New bacteria comes along, they send the information along and say, hey, take this DNA, apply it to yourself, and you're good to go. So people always wonder, well, why would God create diseases? Why did he create viruses? Why did he create bacteria that hurts us? Well, to be perfectly honest, I don't think he did. Viruses transmit DNA from one place to another. That's really what they do. The downside is they transmit mutated information. So the viruses that we have transmit mutated information. These plasmids are kind of like a virus. They take DNA and they help other organisms survive. It may very well be that our DNA was constantly being redone at the beginning. The process of cells regenerating, it's a constant process. I think that was built-in design. God always intended for the skin cells on our skin to keep renewing themselves. I think that was built in. I don't think that's part of the fall. That's design. If everything's working correctly, cells would never die. Now, there are things in DNA that they find called telomeres. I think I'm saying that right. And it's essentially a chunk of at the end of certain strands of material that it shortens every time a cell divides. So as it divides, it shortens. And once it reaches the end, that cell's done, and you got to replace it with a new one. Because, now that I believe is a fallen thing. So God may have been using viruses to replace that information and constantly renew it. We would have lived forever. That's what God said. Adam and Eve would have lived forever. See, the question is not how Adam and Eve lived for so long. The question is, why do we die? You know, there's not a single cell in our body that's more than 10 years old that we know of. A 90-year-old person has nothing in their body older than a 10-year-old person. So why do we age? Because processes begin to fail. The processes that keep your skin nice and smooth begin to fail. Wrinkles start coming out. The process that keeps your hair in your head begins to fail, and it starts falling out. We all experience it. It's a failure of God's design. Well, I'm sorry, that came out wrong. It's mutations that have come in because of sin against God's design. God's design was perfect, but the fall and everything that came in, now we have mutations. Mutations are always a downward spiral. A beneficial mutation is actually not theoretically impossible, but there's a difference between beneficial and new information. As far as we know, to date, not a single beneficial mutation has been observed that anybody knows of with some new kind of DNA information being gained. Now, theoretically, I showed you a quick diagram of all the different kinds of mutations. So it is theoretically possible that you could take a sentence of information and completely rearrange it to make a new sentence. It's not theoretically out of the question. The problem is it has to read forward and backwards and in 3 dimensions and overlap. The probability is still near 0, but we can't say it's impossible. In order for a mutation to occur, existing DNA information and processes must already be in place. You can't have a mutation without those things. Even if a good mutation occurs, it's going to be drowned out by all of the bad ones. So the estimate is there might be if you have 1,000 mutations, 1 might be a good one, and we just haven't found it yet. So we're actually giving them the benefit of the doubt that there might be 1 good mutation. You know, sickle cell anemia is actually the only thing that anybody can use as a possible beneficial mutation. And there's a doctor here that's looking at me with a question mark look on his face. How can sickle cell anemia be beneficial? Well, it's not. But if you live in a place with a lot of malaria, you will survive longer. Because it turns out the virus of malaria won't attach to sickle cells. So your blood cells won't allow the virus to attach. You can't get malaria. You're essentially immune. So if you want to call that a beneficial mutation, that's the best thing anybody's got. But still, you're talking the best of the worst. So it allows you to survive one thing, but now you're going to suffer with something else because of it. By the way, sickle cell anemia is only a 1 base difference. 1 letter changed in the entire DNA strand that causes sickle cell. Just a simple mutation. And I put these numbers up here. I'm not even going to read them. You can go down through them, but it shows that there's a lot of mutations. The fact that we live at all is only God's grace, His preservation of us. And I apologize. I know I'm going long. I'm going to try and go through this last part quickly. Inside DNA are clocks that we can measure. Now, as I said, DNA is complicated. There's many different places where DNA occurs. There's different circumstances. There's different error correction. It's extremely complicated. But mitochondrial DNA is very specific. It's only passed on from mothers to children. It only comes from the mom. No father mitochondrial DNA is put into any child. They got it from their mother. That's it. It stops there. Now, they are able to tell between 2 individuals and the rate of mutations that happen. So the rate of mutations is almost like a half-life. And I'm not sure exactly what that rate is, but they know what it is, and they've measured it, and they've tested it, and everybody agrees on it. But they're able to look at 2 individuals, figure out how many differences there are, and based on those differences, so if there's 4 differences, and I'm making this up, but if there's 4 differences, they're able to go, okay, 4 generations ago, you had the same parent. That's basically the gist of how it works. Now, those aren't the correct numbers, but that's basically it. They can tell the difference. They take the differences and they go, okay, we know that there's a mutation rate, 1 every generation. So we go back 4 generations. It all matches up. That's the same mom. The human DNA clock. And these are awesome. When I found these, I was like, yes, somebody actually finally did a study on this. Humans are believed to have been around for about 200,000 years. Using that view and the rate of mutations in mitochondrial DNA, there should be 681 differences in our genes. The creation estimate is 123 for 6,000 years. The actual data is exactly 123 mutations on average. Well, that's on average. So you're thinking, oh, okay, well, humans. Well, guess what? Mitochondrial DNA is in lots of different kinds of animals. The water flea. They believe the water flea is 125,000 years ago. Now, they have a higher rate of mutation. So according to evolution, it's supposed to be between 51,000 and 323,000 mutations. 6,000 years is 41 to 25. It's not even close. Actual, 165. Right in the creation margin of error. Fruit flies. They're believed to be 4.5. No, that's not right. They're believed to be somewhere in between 1 and 1.5 million years old. I apologize, I think I have a copy-paste error there from the next one. But you can see the numbers there, 180,000 to 4 million. Creation says 54 to 1,200. The actual is between 1,040 and 1,774. So the low end is right inside it, and its magnitude's off from the evolution one. And then the last one we're going to look at is the roundworm. This is the oldest. 4.5 million years, between 3 and 6 million mutations. Creationists say 1,000 to 2,000. Actual, 1,179 to 1,100 or 1,798. Smack dab in the middle. Genes have built-in variety. And I'm not going to go through all this, but I just want you to know there are 30,000 types of genes in the human body. 30,000 types. Inside those types are what's called alleles. So each one of those can have multiple kinds. So hemoglobin has a sickle cell type of itself. So there's all these different types of genes, and usually mutations cause diseases and whatever the case, but there are some mutations that are neutral. So you might have your hair color change slightly, or the curliness of your hair, or whether you could roll your tongue, or whether you've got loopy earlobes, or whatever the case are. Those kind of things can happen. Now, this one, I wanted to make sure I got to. The human genome consists of about 3 billion base pairs, but there are other genomes that are much, much larger. A newt consists of about 15 billion. A lily has 100 billion. Now look at this verse. And why take ye thought for the raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Their basic makeup is 33 times more than the human genome. The amount of bases that the lily of the field has. I'm betting Jesus probably had that in mind a little bit when he said, human beings aren't arrayed. Even the most glorious human being isn't arrayed like the lily of the field. And this is my last slide. Mutations have actually been abandoned. You're like, what? Yeah. Since I was 1 year old. They're still in the textbooks, though. Many don't realize this, but in 1980, leading experts on evolution met in Chicago to discuss whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution, mutation selection, could be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution, changing from one kind to another, so frog to man. This was publicized in the journal Science and in Newsweek. And I copied this out of here, that's why I have the references here. At the risk of doing violence to the positions of some of the people at the meetings, the answer can be given as a clear no. And just to be sure, I actually found the article and downloaded it. I have it on my computer if you would like to read it. That's exactly what the summary of the whole thing says. In 1980, biologists, paleontologists, and all these scientists got together and they argued. I mean, it is funny to read this article because this guy's basically taking meeting notes. And he's like, this guy fired off at this guy, and this guy was yelling at this guy. All scientists think that the other scientists have the answers. So the biologists were yelling at the paleontologists for saying, the answer's in the bones, we can see it. And the paleontologists are going, no, there's no missing links. We can't find any. They don't exist. And the paleontologists are looking at the biologists and going, well, it's in all those things that we see, the similar forearms and all that. And they're going, no, there's thousands and thousands of differences between those things. They look a little different at the surface, but behind the scenes, there's a ton of stuff there. It can't be that. And they just kept going. And in several days, they came out of it going, okay, we need something new. Guess what? Haven't heard about it yet, have we? Because they don't have it. God created all things. The DNA is information that God built. It is the most complex molecule in the universe as far as information storage goes. But we live in a fallen world, and we are in a state of decay. I had to, I apologize, I went 15 minutes over. I had to throw out a ton of information just to get in what I wanted to talk about. The information out there is overwhelming. I have spent years reading it. I am not even through a fraction of it. So I encourage you, go to icr.org, go to Answers in Genesis. They have great ministries. I measure what I read and who I read by the gospel they preach. And they preach a solid gospel. They preach sin, they preach death, they preach salvation, and they are straightforward about it. And they take a lot of heat for it. These guys are getting ridiculed up and down every single day for what they do, but God bless them for doing it. So I highly recommend them. If you want to learn more about everything I have given you has come from either them directly or some resource off their site. If you want all my references, I can give them to you. But I highly recommend, if you're interested in any of this stuff to look into detail, go to their site. So let's bow our heads and give thanks to God for this time that we've had. Our gracious God and Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time, and we thank you for the gospel that you have given us, for the creation account, for the truth that's in it, even for evidence that we are able to find today that definitely alludes to you being the creator. And Father, we know that all things are taken on faith. We know that historical events cannot be proven by man, but we do have thy word. We have an eyewitness account that it is true. And we know that it is taken on faith, and we pray for anyone who has not taken thy word on faith, that you would speak to them, and that you would cause them to look into thy word, to read it, to understand the truths that are in it, especially to understand thy Son, to understand who he was, why he came here, why he died for them, to understand that their sins are forgiven and that all has been taken care of. Pray for any who do not know their sins forgiven, that they would find him, that they would seek him out, that they would find salvation, and ultimately thy word would be praised. We pray to help anyone who confronts in their school or in life these difficult things that can be brought up. We pray to not damage any Christian's faith here. We pray that the Christians here would be able to help others who may be wavering in faith due to Satan's attack on this material, and we would just ask thee to give help in all these things. We thank thee for this time, for this week, and for all you've given us, for the refreshments at the back. We give thanks in his name. Amen. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Give real quick, short, 6-word answers to a couple things.
I will try.
Loch Ness Monster, Sasquatch, Yeti, are those creatures possibly in existence?
Possibly, and they possibly were in existence at one time. Plesiosaurus is a likely suspect for the Loch Ness Monster. Currently in Africa, in the Congo, they believe that there may be both a Brontosaurus-like creature and actually a Triceratops-like creature. The natives there have seen creatures. Now, nobody has photographed it. There's no photographic evidence, so it's all based on, but these people live there, and they're scared of, it's called Mokelembembe or something like that. I think that's how you pronounce it, Mokelembembe. They call this creature. And they say it's huge. It's the size of an elephant. It's got a really long neck, a big long tail. It's mean. It's nasty. It lives in the swamps. And if you hear it coming, you run the other direction. So they're mean, nasty creatures. A lot like what the Bible says about dragons.
There's no fossil record of any intershift between one species to another, correct?
Correct.
Okay. What are your thoughts on cavemen?
Like Neanderthals?
Yeah.
There are, in caves, they find a combination of man and monkey. But that's exactly what they are. There's a distinct division between man and monkey. A Neanderthal has already been reclassified as human beings. So They started off saying that they were ape-like. They've already figured that one out. They're actually been reclassified. There are still many others out there. It turns out recently they did a study on teeth. So the back teeth of human beings come in differently and form differently than the teeth of monkeys. They were teaching that it was because they ate grains and they wore their back teeth down. Well, they're finding out that was a total assumption, and that monkeys actually grow their teeth in a certain way, humans grow it in a different way, and those teeth give a clear classification by just a quick look: monkey, man, monkey, man, monkey, man. So there was a lot more species of monkeys than we thought there were, which is not evolution. And there were definitely different types of man. So even within men, we call them races today, but we have a little bit of speciation. So people in certain areas have distinct features, darker skin, certain, brows, whatever the case is. They are fully 100% human. They were always there by design. So in India, we have some folks from India here. In India, they've shown couples who have basically a mid-range skin tone. Their children can have skin tones from the darkest from the darkest African to the lightest European in one generation. Well, from that, we can guess that God probably made Adam and Eve somewhere in the mid-range skin tone, because in one generation, they could have produced all skin tones without any issues. But it was always there from the beginning by design. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Which types of dogs are the useless ones?
I'm going to remain silent on that one.
Craig, sort of a serious question. Insects. Could they have been part of the fall, or do you think they had a just purely great purpose when they were first created?
Most insects are used for pollinating plants. So they are actually part of the food chain, which is why they are in question as to whether they are actually alive or not. Because they seem to be part of the plant process. They are 100% a part of it. Now, obviously, they seem to be alive. They are intelligent. But some of them don't actually have blood like we have. Some. So if the life is in the blood, and that's where most of the contention comes in, some insects don't really have it the same way we do. So I don't have the answer, but definitely they are part of processes that are necessary for food and for other things. Because of the fall, they have turned, vicious in some cases. There are certain swarms and species of bees that have become what they refer to as killer bees, and whatever the case is. But yeah, they definitely had a purpose and design. Most of it can be accounted for. Yeah, some of it has fallen, and we may not know what their original purpose was. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.